Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. Okay, so on this episode, I am releasing the rest of the conversation I had with Robert Mary. What we did was, Robert was very kind. He was on the podcast a little bit ago, and he's written two books. He's written multiple books, but there's two books of particular interest. He wrote a book on William McKinley, who was the 25th president of the United States. And that book is called President McKinley, Architect of the American Century. And he also wrote a book on the 11th president of the United States, James Polk. That book is called A Country of Vast Designs, James K. Polk, the Mexican War, and the Conquest of the American Continent. Both are fantastic. And so he agreed to come on, and we recorded 2 hours. And we basically gave an hour for each book and each president. And so instead of kind of releasing them together, that would be strange, and, releasing, too many episodes on U.S. presidents kind of at the same time, I decided to space it out. And as it goes, things get busy, other people come on, and then it keeps getting pushed back. But I'm deciding to release this now because it's listening back to it. I think it's a great conversation. Robert has such a good understanding of Polk and who he was and how he was president and why he's important. And it's I really enjoyed listening back to it again. I hadn't listened to it in a while, and it's something that makes me very happy. Is there's a kind of timeless aspect to the conversation. You could listen to this in 20 years and you could still get a lot out of it. So his book has been out for a while now, and so it just shows that how exceptional Robert is at not only writing but telling the essence of important figures. The previous episode is on William McKinley, for those that want to hear that part of the conversation, and that episode is episode 162, and that's entitled "Expansionism and Tariffs: Presidency of William McKinley." As a reminder, Robert Mary has an extensive background as a reporter, newsroom manager, and publishing CEO. He has a bachelor's and master's in journalism, author of numerous books, including the one I mentioned, A Country of Vast Designs, on James K. Polk, the 11th U.S. president, and that's who we talk about in the conversation. We start by giving an overview of James Polk. We talk about the influence of Andrew Jackson on him, Polk's personality and his trajectory, the four major issues he tackled as president, what expansionism looked like for Polk, the Mexican-American War, Polk's one-term deal, saying before he got elected he would only do one term, and he stuck to it. He only served one term. What his legacy is, and many other topics. Robert, I'm sure, is working on another book. He's always working on something. He's a fantastic writer. I highly recommend this book on James Polk, Country of Vast Designs, and his other one on William McKinley. As always, you can find this conversation and all the conversations at Converging Dialogues at Substack.com, also on YouTube. So you can like, subscribe, share with your friends, contribute, all the wonderful things. And now I bring you Robert Mary. I'm here with Robert Mary. Robert, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very excited to talk with you. For folks that don't know who you are, just tell us your kind of potted biography, who you are, what you do, and what are your current interests.
Well, I'm Bob Mary. I'm a retired journalist and publishing executive, almost all of it in Washington, D.C. over the course of 40 years. I covered Washington for the Wall Street Journal when I was young, and then I was an executive and CEO of Congressional Quarterly, a publishing company. And then that got sold to The Economist in 2009, and I edited a couple of foreign policy and political magazines, and now I'm retired, writing books in the Pacific Northwest.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, you've written a fantastic book entitled A Country of Vast Designs, James Polk, the Mexican War,
and the conquest of the American continent. Excuse me. Most folks don't know about James Polk. Before I read the book, I knew a very limited amount of things. He's the 11th president of the United States. So I guess just as a kind of general kind of preamble, if you will, for Polk, what would you say is kind of his defining legacy, and what are the things that make him so consequential, especially kind of saying at the beginning he was going to be a one-term and one-term only president?
Well, he was a consequential president, and he's recognized as such by the historians in the historical polls that are done periodically in terms of ranking and rating the presidents. But he's not recognized by the American people generally. So I thought that the book was worthy in terms of trying to get the American people, the reading public, to understand just what kind of a president he was. So how is he consequential? Well, he basically created the map outline of the continental United States and added tremendous amounts of territory. He increased America by about a third, including what was then Oregon Territory, which was jointly occupied by the British and the Americans. He got most of Oregon, which is Washington, Oregon, Idaho, parts of Montana, and parts of Wyoming. Then he brought in Texas. That annexation process had been started by his predecessor, President Tyler, but he completed that process, so Texas became part of the United States. And then through war with Mexico and an effort to adjudicate some financial issues between the United States and Mexico, he brought in the entire what is now the American Southwest, including California. So it was a tremendous accomplishment, and if he hadn't done that, we would be a much smaller country.
Yeah, I think that mark. I mean, I think you mentioned in the book there was the Louisiana Purchase, and then we get to Polk and how he brought in all the rest of how we understand the continental United States, even still today, is tremendous. Of course, we'll get into a little bit of it. Some of the opinions and ideas about how he did it, and kind of maybe some of the ethics on it. But I think in terms of context of which he was trying to do things for the country and expand it, I think it was huge. I had forgotten this, but in the book you had mentioned that he really kind of molded himself as this Andrew Jackson kind of protege, especially early on. Is that about a fair assessment about how he looked up to Jackson and he saw himself kind of in that vein?
Jackson was his hero.
Yeah.
And Polk's family was very prominent in the Nashville area. Of course, Jackson was the great figure of the South, but also America, but particularly in Tennessee. Mm-hmm. So he pretty much ingested all of the Jacksonian ethos and the attitude and the outlook. And Jackson was a friend of his family, so he kind of grew up with Jackson. He was a protege. Jackson fostered his career, advised him on all kinds of things, including the person he should marry. And Jackson had other proteges. He had many. But the two that were sort of lingering by the time Polk and Martin Van Buren were vying to be president in 1844 were Van Buren and Polk. Very different people, but both were had their careers fostered very much by Jackson.
I have to imagine that some of the Tennessee thing had to have factored in there a little bit. They're both from the same kind of area. It's very early on in the country. He has this interesting rise of Polk does from doing law to Tennessee representative, being part of Ways and Means, Speaker of the House, governor, and then president. So what's the kind of arc of sorts of this trajectory? It's not totally uncommon, but it is an interesting one. What can you say about his trajectory there?
Well, I would say it was sort of a natural trajectory. Every position he got was sort of built on the previous one. But let's just step back just a touch and talk about Polk as a human being, as a man. Mm-hmm. He was not a prepossessing guy, unlike Jackson. He wasn't the kind of guy who brought people instantly to his side, cajoling and having huge impact on people with his force of personality. Polk was a man of somewhat drabness of temperament. small of stature, average height, but relatively slim, and drab of personality. But he had one thing that people didn't always recognize, and therefore a lot of people underestimated him. He had an iron will. When he decided he wanted to do something, he just would tenaciously grab onto that and never let go. And he did that as president. He did that in the House, serving pretty much Jackson's interest when he was a very young 30-year-old congressman, elected the same year Jackson was elected president, and demonstrated that during his Ways and Means tenure. He was a free trader, of course, the South was. And also then in terms of the other positions that you mentioned, the governor's position, which, by the way, he lost in an election after a 2-year term, and tried to get the job back, and lost again. And by that time, people thought that this guy's career was pretty much over. And many people thought, well, he kind of deserves it because he's not really as significant as he thinks he is. But it turned out that he was underestimated once again.
Yeah, he has an interesting trajectory. And I think you mentioned also in the book about his temperament. The kind of iron will, that he definitely had some affinity for political ideology as well. He was very much a part of the era in the party. What were some of the key issues there in as governor and when he was in the House, especially in terms of the national bank? I know that was a big thing for many presidents in that period. And many people have made a lot of interesting ideas about a national bank or federal bank or things like that. I guess for him, just as an example of how he took an issue with something and he kind of stayed on course for whatever his position was.
Well, let's note that James Polk was not a particularly likable man. He wasn't unlikable. He didn't have any nasty traits about him, but he didn't much like people. He wasn't an outgoing sort of a guy. He didn't really like the kind of politics, backslapping politics that a lot of people engaged in those times and in any time. I've often said in my speeches on this book that if the audience, sometimes as many as 200 people, and I were sitting in a tavern having happy hour and enjoying ourselves, and we noticed by chance that Jimmy Polk was over at the end of the bar drinking by himself, the question might come up, well, should we invite him over so he wouldn't be drinking alone? Probably no, because he wasn't the kind of person that you sort of gravitated to. But as we say, he did have that tenacity, which served him very, very well. The issues were the standard issues between the Whigs, the party founded by Henry Clay, the successor party to the Federalists, really, and the Democratic Republicans, and then the Democrats under first Jefferson and then Jackson. The Democrats were small government people. They believed in strict construction of the Constitution. Jackson was opposed to public works projects to cut across state lines. He vetoed the Maysville road bill. He vetoed the Second Bank of the U.S. bill. And the Whigs under Clay, let's say, were much more inclined to use the power of the federal government for what they considered to be good works in behalf of American greatness. Both of those people, Jackson and Clay, or Polk and Clay, were great patriots. They loved America and they believed in American greatness, but they have different views about how to reach it. So that was the major fault line that I would say, and that was seen when Polk was in the House serving the interests of Jackson on both Maysville and the bank and other issues. It could be seen when he was in the Ways and Means Committee attempting to cut tariff rates, which was part of the Jackson ethos. And it was seen in his governorship, which was not, those national issues didn't really come into play so much in those days at the gubernatorial level, but to whatever extent they did, he was projecting that same mentality.
I want to jump to the presidency, just because, I mean, his life is very interesting, but I want to focus on his presidency, because there's many things there. Just before that, maybe talk about the election a little bit of running for president and kind of what happened. There's obviously the issue with John Tyler. You got to talk about John Tyler, kind of talking about Polk, and he was obviously the precursor to him. And how was annexation of Texas such a big thing? Where does Clay fit in here? Just kind of tell us kind of the environment and the run up to him running and then eventually winning the election.
Yeah, let me step back just a touch.
Sure.
And note that, as I just noted in passing a few minutes ago, that Polk was governor of Tennessee. He didn't really want to run for governor, but he was enjoined to do it by the powers that be in the Democratic Party in Tennessee because he didn't really have somebody to carry the banner. He liked being in Congress, but he went out and he ran for governor, and he won. He was in a 2-year term. Then he ran for re-election, thinking that if he won, that would really put him in good position to run for president in 1844. And he lost. He lost to a kind of a jokester character from the backwoods of Tennessee named James Jones. They called him Lean Jimmy Jones, tall, lanky fellow. And he kind of made a joke of everything. And Polk, of course, being so serious and sober-sided, didn't handle that very well. Whenever he tried to make a quip, Jimmy Jones would sort of run circles around him because he was the quipster. And so 2 years later, after losing, he ran against Jimmy Jones a second time and lost again. And at this point, just about everybody in American politics at that time said, James Polk is dead. He's gone.
Right.
But he wasn't prepared to give up his career. And he thought that the only way to get back was to somehow manage to get on the presidential ticket as vice president. In those days, you could actually run for vice president. You weren't always just strictly chosen by the presidential candidate. So he did. And it wasn't going very well because everyone thought that Buchanan, who had been president, lost the presidency. Now it's 4 years later after that loss, and he's trying to get it back. Everyone thought he was the front runner. He didn't seem to be particularly enamored of Polk, and he wasn't being very encouraging in terms of, well, I'm going to do everything I can to get you on the ticket. So it wasn't clear that he was going to be able to do this comeback that he was trying to bring about. Then, as you note, something very significant happened during the sort of what you might call the primary season. They didn't have primaries in those days, but during that season leading up to the nomination and the convention, which was going to be in Baltimore in the spring of 1844. And that was that John Tyler entered into negotiations with the independent country of Texas, which had won its independence from Mexico in 1836, 8 years before, for Texas to come into the Union. And this was explosive. It galvanized a feeling of expansionism, the whole concept of manifest destiny in the country. And Polk embraced it just naturally. I mean, he would have embraced it. Jackson would have embraced it. Therefore, Polk would have embraced it. But interestingly, both Henry Clay, who was the putative candidate for the Whig Party, and Martin Van Buren, the front runner for the Democratic nomination, they opposed it. They had good reasons for doing so. Polk, both Van Buren and Clay feared that this would lead to a war with Mexico, which was a very realistic view, number one. And number two, they thought it would exacerbate the slavery issue, which it would and which it did. So they opposed it, but the American people favored it. And Polk, who had embraced it immediately and quite enthusiastically, kind of shot ahead in terms of political thinking. And so there was a raucous Democratic convention in Baltimore in the spring. And Van Buren running against Lewis Cass of Michigan. There's no way, there was the hatred between those two factions was so deep that there was no way that either one was going to allow the other one to become the nominee. And so Polk, after about 9 ballots, was emergent as the first dark horse political presidential nominee in American history. And he got the nomination, and then he pulled out a very, very narrow victory over Clay by some 36,000 votes nationally. And if Clay had embraced Texas annexation, I think that most likely he would have become president.
It's a very interesting thing about how much of the country supported, annexation of Texas, but there were other key figures that did not, and which, again, is a kind of something in the background to keep in mind of this idea of expansionism, which, I think it has a kind of negative connotation in current day. But I think at the time, it's when you're a young country and you're an expanding country, you're trying to expand, and you're trying to, still come out of the, the shadow or the presence of England and things like that. I think it's obviously important to kind of set yourself out, but I guess it becomes more of how you do it, which for Polk, when he wins the presidency, you say in the book that he had 4 major issues he wanted to tackle. There was the Oregon question, California, trying to get California, reducing the tariffs of 42, and reviving an independent treasury. So, and then obviously Texas is in there as well as a big piece, which we just mentioned. So maybe just talk about those 4 issues, why those, and how he went about doing it.
Well, let's talk about the domestic ones first and get them out of the way. He wanted to reduce the tariff because he was a Democrat, and the Democrats believed in low tariffs. He had a problem, though, when he was running for president, and that is that Pennsylvania was a crucial state, big state, a lot of electoral college votes, and it was an industrial state, and therefore it believed in high tariffs and protectionism. And the Democratic Party didn't, but he had to get Pennsylvania. So in the campaign, he had to sort of finesse that issue, and he did it rather cleverly, and I think not in a cynical way, but he basically said, look, we're going to reduce tariffs, and we're going to create a tariff system. Bear in mind that those were the days when tariffs were the main source of revenue for the United States. And he said, we're going to do it in a way that sustains our ability to finance the government in a responsible way. But within that context, we are going to fashion the tariff structures for various products to help those industries most in need. And most of those industries turn out to be in Pennsylvania. So he was true to his philosophy and the Democratic philosophy while trying to mollify the feelings of people in Pennsylvania. And he managed to do that somewhat successfully. So he, in the course of a lot of big issues happening, including a war, he put forward the tariff issue in Congress. He got it passed. He signed it. So that was good. The independent treasury is a complex thing, and I'll just try to explain it in sort of general terms.
Sure.
The question was, how does the United States, first of all, what kind of a repository does it have for federal monies? Where are the federal monies going to be parked when they're not being used? And how does the United States use the banking system, which wasn't much of a banking system at all at that time, to maintain currency stability? And Hamilton's idea, Alexander Hamilton and Clay and others of that political position, thought that the way to do that was through this Bank of the U.S., the first bank, and it was expired, and then the second bank was created. And it was kind of like a little bit like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae in our time, a very powerful private-public alliance sort of thing. And it did have a history of corruption, which Jackson, who was totally opposed to entrenched power, had predicted and fought. So the idea of the independent treasury was to sort of solve that dilemma, that economic, financial problem. And he pulled that off as well. So now we're talking about Oregon Territory and California. Interesting, he didn't say this American Southwest. what's now New Mexico or Arizona or Utah, but it ultimately got pulled into the mix.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the Northwest, the boundary between Canada and the United States had always been a major issue. And at some point prior to Polk, to the Rocky Mountains, from the Lake of the Woods in Minnesota to the top of the Rocky Mountains, it was established as the 49th parallel.
Yeah.
But Oregon Territory extended far north of the 49th parallel into what is now Canada, all of British Columbia, I think either all or large parts of Edmonton. And so the question was, what are we going to do west of the Rockies? And the United States and Great Britain both had claims to the entire territory, but we weren't going to go to war over that, or we hoped we wouldn't. And so for a good number of years, I think it was 20 some years, we had been basically occupying and managing those lands jointly, with the understanding that it was going to be negotiated. And there were many, many attempts to negotiate that line going west of the Rockies. And our position, the U.S. position, was, okay, let's just extend the 49th parallel straight across because it's worked up to the Rockies, and let's just do that. Well, the Brits, with all their power, and they had the great Navy and the ability to move troops, said, I tell you what, let's go west on the 49th, just as you say. When we come to the Columbia River, we'll go down the Columbia River and we'll take everything north of that, which meant all of Washington and all of Washington State, including Puget Sound. And Americans would never accept that. So Polk, in his inaugural address, basically said it was very, very inflammatory. He said he made a statement that our claim to all of Oregon, meaning all the way north, well far above the 49th parallel, which we had never tried to negotiate, was clear and uncontested, that we basically had a claim to the whole thing and we're going to stake that claim. It was a negotiating position on his part. He was playing pretty smart negotiating politics. But it was totally incendiary. The Brits went crazy. And so when he finally kind of said, okay, he went to the ambassador of Great Britain in Washington, D.C. and said, well, I'll come down to the 49th parallel and you guys give up that whole idea of taking north of the Columbia River. And the British ambassador, a guy named Pakenham, basically rejected it out of hand and didn't even send it to London for review. He got into some trouble for that because he really should have, but he just rejected it out of hand. And Polk went nuts. He was really mad. And they said, okay, I'm through negotiating. You guys want to negotiate? You come back, because I've given you my position, which was I came down a great deal from what I said in my inaugural address. And so now the Brits were sort of on the hook. And they had some other problems. They had the Corn Laws to worry about and other things. And so ultimately they came back. There had to be some kind of a compromise, and the compromise was very smart, and it was Polk's. We'll go the 49th parallel all the way to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. We'll come to the Vancouver Island, which juts down south of that line, and we'll go down around, and you can have all of Vancouver Island. So that was enough of a compromise so that the Brits wouldn't lose face in taking it. So we got Washington, Oregon, all of Idaho, parts of Montana, and parts of Wyoming. So that was a big chunk of land. Now, California. And here we get into the controversy that surrounds Polk and has for much of it during his presidency and through history, and has made him a man who the academics are tending to discredit more than they used to. America and the United States and Mexico the relations between those two countries were not good for a number of reasons. The annexation of Texas set the Mexicans off big time. They hadn't been able to do anything about Texas independence.
Right.
But they refused to recognize that Texas was an independent nation and that that land was not their own anymore, even though it had been recognized by most of the European countries and the United States. So that was a sticking point. The other thing was there was a whole series of abuses. Mexico was not very good at maintaining order. Abuses of American citizens, many of them business people trying to do business in Mexico or around Mexico. There was piracy, cargoes being stolen, other things being stolen. There were some murders. And all of those led to some reparation requirements that needed to be negotiated. And Mexico was not being very forthcoming in the negotiations. France actually invaded Mexico at Veracruz to get its reparation payments for its citizens who had been abused by Mexico or Mexican people or Mexican officials. And Britain threatened war reprisals. And they settled with both France and Britain, but we were much more soft in our demands, and the Mexicans didn't have any money. And so they basically rebuffed those claims and those requirements. And that was a sticking point. So Polk comes in and he sees that as a great opportunity because they owed us millions of dollars. They owed American citizens millions of dollars that we would have adjudicated. And he basically said, look, why don't we pay these in lieu of the Mexicans, and then they can pay us back in property and land, including California. So he tried to negotiate something like that, and they was totally rebuffed. And then I'm going on here a bit, but there's one more point that I think needs to be sort of mentioned.
Yeah.
And that is that when we annexed Texas, we sought to annex all the lands that Texas claimed as part of Texas sovereignty, including the land between the Nueces and the Rio Grande rivers. And that was what Texas claimed all the way to the Rio Grande. But Mexico claimed that no, you can't have that land. That land between those two rivers still belongs to us. Well, they didn't have the power to get it back militarily. It was a little bit silly, really, but it was disputed land. And we inherited that dispute when we annexed Texas. So when Polk, when the Mexicans put an army on the Rio Grande, on their side of the Rio Grande, Polk sent an army under Zach Taylor to the other side of the Rio Grande, which was smack dab in the middle of what was disputed territory. And the Mexicans thought that we ought not to have done that. Now, I would argue that in even recognizing that it was disputed territory and that dispute had to be negotiated and adjudicated, nevertheless, he wasn't necessarily in a position to sort of stand back and let the Mexicans occupy the land. I think it was probably justified for him to say, well, okay, we'll hold it in trust until we can figure out mutually what's the proper, and we weren't going to give up that land. But nevertheless, he put troops in disputed territory, and that precipitated an incident in which several Americans were killed, and that led to the Mexican War, the American-Mexican War.
So, two questions here. The first question is, what was the overall motivations for Polk? Was there a grand plan here, or was this just kind of, look, here's some gray areas, here's some, this land isn't really claimed officially by anybody, or too many people have too many claims to it, both with Oregon and then within the Southwest. Was that kind of the plan all along? Like, let's get all of this land to the Pacific Ocean as ours, and we'll just use different strategies? Or was this just something that kind of happened as these were events that were just in his time and he just dealt with them as they arose? What's the kind of difference there?
Well, I'll answer that in two phases. One is looking at Polk himself, and that's a bit of a mystery. And then the other is sort of the United States of America. Looking at Polk, it's not absolutely clear. Your question is very apt because it isn't entirely clear,
Yeah.
although he was a bit of a visionary. The problem was he didn't confide in anybody. So he did confide in his naval secretary Bancroft, the famous historian, who is the one who tells us that he had 4 goals he wanted to accomplish. So he did have those 4 goals. They were in his mind as he was elected and he was putting his cabinet together and looking forward to being president. So that's clear. But how was he going to do it? And how did it fit into an overall philosophy, which I think was sort of the essence of your question?
Yeah.
I don't think we really know. And partly we don't know because he just kept his cards so close to the vest that you can't really see. But I think that he was in fact a man of vision. And it gets to my second phase of the question, which is, what about America? America, well, the title of the book says it all, which was a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, which he said America is basically, didn't use these words, but a country on the move. It's a country of vast designs, of energy, and basically that it's irrepressible. It's an irrepressible nation. And you had all these lands, and we didn't have any. We had a legitimate claim to Oregon, but we had no claim to any of the lands in the Southwest of California, or Texas for that matter. Although it was certainly legitimate for us to negotiate an annexation of Texas if the Texans wanted to be annexed. But the American people saw this vast land mass in the midsection of North America and realized that if they could command that and command the position on 2 oceans, with the budding railroad tracks, stitching the whole thing together, this was going to be one hell of a nation.
Yeah.
And that was an electrifying concept. So I think that's what basically led to the almost irrepressible American expansionism.
I guess the big thorny point, or there's a few of them. You mentioned it before. You kind of detailed some of the aspects of Texas and Mexico. Polk gets a lot of criticism about expansionism, and I think kind of connected and maybe subsequent to that is also some of the problematic and troublesome aspects of how for much of these lands were inhabited by indigenous tribes and peoples, and so that's another angle to it. So you got different world powers saying this is ours, then you got our neighbors in Mexico saying this is ours, and then you have indigenous tribes and people groups that are saying, well, we've been here for a long time. Is this all part of the I won't say controversy, but is this what makes him get a lot of critiques now, or what are the primary criticisms that Polk gets from academics and historians when they're kind of looking on his place in history or some of the pitfalls or shortcomings of his role in this?
Well, that's a really, it's not just a very valid question, but I think it's a almost necessary question to pursue. We live in a time where our past is under criticism and under a lot of pressure from people who wonder whether we are, in fact, the great people that we sort of had thought we were, or that many people still think we are. And it's interesting that when the polls of historians in terms of ranking the presidents began in 1948 with Arthur Schlesinger Sr. of Harvard doing a poll, which was published in Life magazine. Polk was very, very high. I think he was ranked 8th or 9th. Wow. Because the historians recognized that he was a very consequential president that left a lot of change, significant change for America in his wake. They weren't very concerned very much about, well, what's the moral dimension of these questions? And I think that these historians knew something that a lot of people in today's environment aren't taking into account so completely. And that is that much of these lands were just Mexico was a very poor country. It was a dysfunctional country. The population growth had been almost stunted, whereas America was growing population to fairly well.
Right.
And that much of this land was strategic. And if Mexico couldn't administer these lands, who was going to get them? Well, probably Britain.
Mm-hmm.
Britain definitely wanted to prevent that American expansionism and the sea to sea positioning on the North American continent that we were sort of looking at salivating. So my own view is that it was almost like an inevitable historical development emanating out of power differentials that always drive history. And they drove history in this instance significantly.
Yeah, I think that's important to remember. I think the thing with history is I think there's always, different time to look at different aspects, but I think it's important to keep the context of where things are. And I'm sure, 150 years, 200 years from now, people will look at, this time and say like, oh my goodness, why didn't they look at this and this and this? And you have to understand things are in context and things are kind of a live ball of sorts. And so it's there's ways we can always improve, but I think those things it is important to keep the whole kind of gestalt of things, the whole big picture.
Right.
Two, I guess, final kind of bigger questions for Polk here is, so kind of about the Mexican-American War. There's some Americans don't even realize we had a war with Mexico at some point, right?
I think, Xavier, which they really don't recognize or don't know, is that we planted an army in the heartland, right in downtown Mexico City.
Yes,
and planted the American flag on their civic building. Every Mexican school child knows that, but not every American school child knows that.
Yes, it is absolutely wild. When I was rereading your book, I was reminded of that. It's like, oh my goodness. So obviously, I'm not going to ask you to detail the whole account of the Mexican-American War, but just kind of just the you started with some of it, but there was a lot of key players here. So Buchanan, who became the 15th president, he was a big player here. Scott, who was a big general. Trist. There was a lot of different major players with big personalities and how they handled it, well or not so well. And so I guess, overall, just kind of, what happened and how do we get it to end and get some peace and what was the kind of end result?
Well, it was presumed that it was going to be a very short war. Polk thought that he had his army under Zachary Taylor at the Rio Grande, and he could move south into Mexico. And he did. And he had a number of battles. He thought that the Mexicans would very shortly sue for peace, and then he would be able to open up his whole point about, okay, we've got these reparations payments that they're hanging over you, and we're going to take care of that for you, but we need land. But it didn't work that way. The Mexicans maybe they didn't live in a highly functional country, but they had a lot of self-regard and a lot of self-respect, and they weren't going to buckle. So Zachary Taylor found himself kind of bogged down. The terrain was not good. You weren't going to be able to continue moving with that army and force a settlement. So he brought, you just mentioned the other general.
Trist and Scott?
Scott.
Yeah.
To create a amphibious landing at Veracruz, which he did. He sieged Veracruz and sent in a lot of armaments. And when Veracruz crumbled, he went to Mexico City on the same route that Cortez had used so many centuries before. And so we besieged Mexico City. We entered Mexico City. And Santa Anna, the general, sort of escaped out of that trap and forced a settlement. which was along the lines of what I've described.
Hmm.
So it turned out that the war lasted 2 years, and there was a great deal of patriotic fervor at the beginning, but wars in which your army gets bogged down and things aren't moving very much tend to lose public support, and that happened to Polk. And so he did lose a lot of public support along the way, and if he hadn't been able to negotiate this settlement at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, he would probably be looked at as a real goat of a president in our time. He did. And he did manage to bring an end to the war and did manage to bring in those vast territories. I will say that I mentioned earlier that Clay and Van Buren were concerned about the exacerbation of the slavery issue as a result of acquiring territory from the Mexican-American War.
Right.
And that was a very apt concern, because as soon as Polk, he needed money to try to negotiate an early settlement. So he looked for an appropriation. And as soon as people realized that the settlement was going to entail the acquisition of territory, the whole question of whether slavery was or was not going to be allowed in those territories became front and center with the Wilmot Proviso. And the Wilmot Proviso almost led to Southern secession in 1849, 1850. So those guys, Van Buren and Clay, were not incorrect. They were very accurate in suggesting that this was going to really inflame the slavery issue.
Yeah, it's interesting about kind of the Mexico City thing, as you mentioned. We went all the way down. I mean, from the border of Mexico and, let's say, Texas to Mexico City is super far. I mean, the fact that we got that much inland to Mexico and then tried to have the settlement, planting the American flag is just really incredible in a not an achievement way, but in a kind of almost in a terrible way of like, wow, like this is how far we were going to go to do this. And it's interesting how, we understand things now with, we understand how Mexico is today and the United States is today, but just kind of transporting ourselves back in time of, what it was like and what were the interests and what was going on and how far we were willing to go and try and have some of these things happen it's pretty astonishing in some ways when you think about it.
Well, Winfield Scott was absolutely brilliant in this maneuver, both the amphibious landing and moving all the way down to Mexico City, never losing a battle, and often outnumbered tremendously by Santa Anna troops. So yeah, it's a very significant development and showed the moxie and the military capacity of the United States of America at that time.
Yeah. So I guess the last question I have here is I mentioned at the beginning is, Polk said at the beginning he was going to do one term. Now, back then, until I guess it was 40 something, right? Or 50 something, we only had, there was unlimited terms. So people could have run as many times as they want. And obviously FDR had 4 terms that he won, but everyone else only did 2. Although people really wanted Washington to do 3, and he didn't, and other people wanted to do 3. But why did Polk, with unlimited terms, why did he set out to just do the 4 years? And further on that, how do we, what's kind of his main legacy, and how should people really, the American people, try to understand an accurate view of his one-term presidency?
Well, the one-term thing is very, very interesting, and he made that commitment upon getting the nomination.
Mm-hmm.
No one else has done that. There have been some who have said it after they were elected.
Yeah,
but he said it as an election point. In other words, as you consider voting for me, keep in mind that I'm making a commitment that I'm only going to serve one term. And it's clear that various people tried to get him to renege on that and go for a second term.
Right.
I'm not sure he would have been reelected because the war had sapped his political standing significantly. But there are 2 reasons. One was sort of philosophical and maybe not all that significant. The other was political, practical, and very significant. The philosophical one was that Polk, like Jackson, was totally against entrenched power, and power that is in place for a long time is entrenched. And he was opposed to it, so it was sort of consistent with his political philosophy. But that doesn't make a lot of sense because, after all, Jackson had the same views about entrenched power, and he had 2 terms. And there's no reason why Polk would have to be more pristine than Jackson was. More significantly, Polk got the nomination. Bear in mind that I was pointing out that he wasn't considered a man that was was likely to get the nomination. He was underestimated, and he wasn't viewed as a great leader. And the party had a lot of great, powerful men at that time: Thomas Hart Benton, Van Buren, senator and governor from New York, whose name escapes me right now, but was very prominent in the day, and other rising stars. And I think that the Polk rightly perceived that if these guys thought that he could possibly be entrenched for 8 years, and that they would be out of pocket for 8 years, that they weren't going to get behind him in the general election of 1844. He knew he was going to be running in a very, very tight race with Clay. So he felt that if they knew that he was only going to be in place for 4 years, they would be more likely to say, okay, we'll give the little guy 4 years, but we're not going to give him 8. So we'll get behind him because he's our only nominee. So I think that was the main reason.
I mean, just one thing here. So many times I hear common folk or just, people that I run into say, and granted, I mean, there are some aspects of this that are true, but that, oh my goodness, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, or, everything's politicized, and like, oh, the DNC and the RNC and how they just politicize everything. And I think for most historians, and I think for most writers on history that understand, it's always been political. The party always, and sometimes you could say more so, right? At certain points in history where you'll have the party selecting who they want and who they don't want, and pushing some people out and pushing some people up. And that's just kind of how political parties, in some sense, politically just work. And that's how it kind of functions. And so obviously there are things that are unique about each time, including our own, but that kind of aspect is not all that different. I don't know if you would say the same.
Well, I would say this, that there's one constant in politics and history. It's basically it's variables. And almost everything is variable except for the one constant, and that's human nature.
Sure. Yeah.
Nature doesn't change.
Yeah.
A lot of people think you can change it, and I think that's fraught with all kinds of mischief. But human nature doesn't change, and therefore you can anticipate that given the stimuli, when the stimuli is external circumstances, that you're going to get the same sort of thing, which means everything is politics, and politics is everything.
Yeah. Yes. Any final thoughts, I guess, on the way we, what would make kind of make you happy, or think what would make you, feel like, yeah, that's accurate of how we should view Polk in terms of American minds and our history?
Well, I guess it indicates that there's all kinds of political personalities, and there are all kinds of political approaches that emanate out of those personalities. And there's all kinds of political success that comes about as a result of various kinds of personalities. And Polk's a good example of that. Not the kind of person of the sort of the majesty of a Washington, or the cleverness of a Jefferson, or the rugged power of a raw power of a Jackson, a saintly genius of a Lincoln. Right. He didn't have any of that, but he did have those traits that we talked about earlier, especially that tenacity, that he just worked all the time. He never gave up, and he never stopped working and playing or applying and trying to figure out what's going to happen next, and how he's going to get Thomas Hart Benton on this one, and how he's going to get Martin Van Buren to back off on the other thing. He was a very consequential president, not a particularly likable man, but very much of a president who left a strong and powerful and significant American legacy.
Yeah. Well, your book is brilliant. It's called A Country of Vast Designs, James Polk, Mexican War and Conquest of the American Continent. It's out. It's been out for a couple of years. It's in paperback now, and it is the go-to in my mind of understanding President Polk. So appreciate it.
Thank you very much.